we're going to choose. And so we can take the same movement, the same hand strike, for example. Let's take an outward hammer fist or outward hand sword, diagonally downward, because it's a very common strike we're going to use for many different targets. That particular strike could fit to the back of the neck, and it's a good idea to strike downward diagonally because we'll explain more why that is. There's several benefits. There's more power, there's more accuracy. But we're usually going to strike diagonally downward when we strike to the back of the neck, right? The same thing to the kidney. If we were going to do, now it's probably, you wouldn't probably do a hand sword because a hammer fist fits better, but it's the same motion of your arm, right? You can do a downward diagonal strike to the kidney, right? And you can do the same downward diagonal strike now as a hand sword again to the back of the knee. It's the same strike. It doesn't matter if you hit the back of the neck or the kidney or the back of the knee. It's usually done at the same angle, more or less. It's somewhere around a 45-degree angle downward, right? And each one of these strikes belongs to a different stance, or vice versa. So if we're in a neutral bow stance, this hammer fist or hand sword to the back of the neck would fit quite well, right? If we wanted to strike to the back of the kidney in the same, using the same diagonal path of action right here, right? Well, we can simply drop to a wide kneel stance, and with the same erect posture that we always want to maintain, we are now able to hit that kidney quite easily, right? And if we want to strike to the back of the knee, which is obviously even lower, right? We can now, use a close kneel stance in order to drop low enough so that our hand sword can now do that exact same motion that we did a moment ago to the kidney, a moment before that we did to the back of the neck. 3 different height zones, 3 different stances, same strike, right? Same strike. So I hope that's a good way of looking at how the inclusion of wide kneel stances and close kneel stances give us additional height zones with additional targets that are now available that we otherwise would not have available without these stances. And you can see it here in these techniques, right? So in here we have a self-defense technique. This is from blue belt, and it's against the right step through punch, right? And it's going to employ a neutral bow and a wide kneel stance and a close kneel stance, and it's going to hit all 3 different height zones, right? And then here, this is also on purple belt. We have a technique against somebody pinning your hand after you did an unintentional push to your opponent's chest. So the neutral bow followed by the wide kneel again gives you these different height zones that are now exposed, and a move that sometimes might be done to your opponent's head or his torso is now being done to his legs. And you again achieve that by dropping down in your stance into a wide kneel or a close kneel stance. But now before we finish discussing the wide kneel and close kneel stance, we got to make sure we don't forget, I mentioned this once earlier, that we can combine, in most cases, or in many cases, the gravitational marriage of dropping lower with rotational force. There's often still rotation possible when you drop from a neutral or forward bow down to either a wide kneel or a close kneel stance. So if we look right here, this is a technique of a blue belt, and we're going to look at this right outward hand sword, left inward hand sword combination right here. You could, especially if you look just at the left inward hand sword, you could use just rotational force in order to drive that, right? You could already have that hand at the height of where you're going to try to hit, in this case the back of the neck, and you could just simply rotate in place in order to strike more forcefully, right? But you could also, instead of that, not use any rotation at all, and instead of rotating, you could simply drop. You could have your hand already in position above the target, so just simply by dropping, you can now hit much more forcefully than what the arm otherwise could do by itself, right? Well, if you can do those 2 different things, and you have 2 different motions that your body can employ, obviously you can combine them and you can do both of those simultaneously, right? So we are going to rotate into our wide kneel stance or close kneel stance, and we are also going to drop down into one of those stances, right? And so we're going to have those 2 types of body momentum combined right here, the rotational force as well as the gravitational marriage. And if you shuffled in just before doing it, then you also have forward momentum. So you can have percentages of 1, percentages of the second and percentages of the third. You can have all three body momentum types available. And this particular blue belt technique that we're looking at right here is also a very, very good example how there's one more benefit we haven't really mentioned about the lower position of a wide kneel or a close kneel, and that is that you can now strike a target from underneath, right? We haven't done that really before. This is one of the first examples. We're going to have that in a few techniques throughout our belt levels that we will, you know, we actually caused our opponent to bend forward, right? But now that means some of his targets are available by, you know, striking upward from underneath, like a kick might do. But in this case, we're going to still use our hand, and we're going to get our hand in a position where it can do this by dropping into this very, very low close kneel stance, right? So we can see how this opens up additional targets for us though, right? And additional zones for us. Alright, so there you have it. That's what I got to say about the wide kneel stance and the close kneel stance. I hope this helps. So next, let's talk about the twist stance. The twist stance is a very unique stance, very fascinating, and it's very important. It is also a very difficult stance to master. The fastest way to get comfortable with the twist stance for most students is usually to compare it to a crossover and start working with a crossover first. Because that's also how you can find the proper dimensions in the twist stance. Right? So when you're doing a crossover, you are for a moment in the exact same position as you would usually be in a twist stance. So if we do this crossover and then hold that position once our rear foot touches the ground, and if we now settle our weight, we now have a stance, right? This is the twist stance now, stemming out of a crossover maneuver, but it's now stationary and it's settling in place, right? The weight distribution is now 50-50, and you basically determine the depth of your stance by having your rear leg bend with your rear heel raising up off the ground, right? Until your rear knee rests on the calf of the front leg, right? Right in the back of the knee of the front leg, all right? The front foot is flat on the ground, but of course now it's pointing in the opposite direction. And if you take this whole stance and turn it around the other way, well then that gives us the rear twist stance, right? That's why some people will say that the rear twist stance and the front twist stance, they're exactly identical, except for one thing. What is different is the line of sight, right? Now of course we have to look at there is front crossovers and there are rear crossovers. And they are basically just moving versions of a front twist stance and a rear twist stance. Right? And we can see with the crossovers that they actually set up certain, a lot of times there'll be kicks that they set up, but they set up certain other footwork that allows us then to continue on afterwards. Right? That's the whole point of these crossovers. It's not that you're not making the contact. You're not choosing your strike to be timed with the crossover. It is when you move out of the crossover. The crossover was just getting you there, right? It was never designed to be a stance where you settle into. Now that's what's different with the twist stance. So a lot of students have the opportunity to get their crossovers down relatively soon. You know, orange belt level, purple belt level, you probably are able to already do your crossovers. Twist stances, not so much. I would really go as far as saying that the twist stance is probably the most difficult stance to master in Ed Parker's Kenpo. Your two stances that are going to be most difficult will be the forward bow stance and the twist stance. In terms of actually developing the stance, being able to do it, and doing it properly, that can take years. It takes a long time, and the twist stance, of course, isn't worked as early on. It's gradually introduced as you go up through your belt levels. And it's really not going to be highlighted or used extensively until about, well, third brown, second brown, and then it's really consistent. If you look at all the extensions in the Kenpo system, it's hard to find an extension that doesn't use twist stances, right? On orange belt, they start, we use them on orange belt, we use them very heavily for dual strikes. And we talked about that a little bit before when we discussed the stance changes. But so let's look at what makes this twist stance so difficult. Why is it so difficult to develop? Well, stances have to give you, besides the things we already mentioned, right, balance and protection and mobility and availability of all your natural weapons, let's talk about the balance part here. That's really where twist stance is so different. It changes your balance in a few different ways. And when we talk about balance, we're also talking about stability and bracing angles. How do you get balance in the stance? Well, you get it through bracing angles. There is depth bracing angles and there's width bracing angles. In other words, there is how far your feet are apart, especially say if you look at a neutral bow stance. That braces you in the dimension of depth. But in other words, you're not going to fall over forward or backwards now, right? But you could still be pushed off balance left or right, laterally, right? So how do you make sure nobody pushes you left or right? Well, that's the feet themselves that do that. If you look within the foot itself, it is now a weight distribution that takes place between the ball of the foot and the heel of the foot, right? You wouldn't have sideways or lateral stability in your neutral bow stance if you had all your weight on your heels, right? It has to be distributed, and it's usually a little bit more on the ball. About 60% of your weight is probably going to be on the ball of the foot. That's a rough estimate. 40% on the heel, right? Now the neutral bow stance, aside from fighting horse or horse stance, the neutral bow stance is the only stance that gives you both feet to do this with. You have lateral stability with both feet. Now your feet are in a 45-degree angle, right? But that still gives you lateral stability. Most other stances don't. When you go into a forward bow stance, you only have your front foot left that gives you lateral stability. Your back foot is not going to help you from being pushed left or right, sideways, right? Same thing in a cat stance. Now it's your front foot that's not going to help you from getting pushed over left or right, and your rear foot is the only one that gives you that stability, right? Widening and closing stances is back to the front foot. They are basically the same. They suffer the same fate as a forward bow stance, right? Only a front foot is left to prevent you from being pushed over left or right, sideways, laterally, right? So that's one difference. So the twist stance has that, just like the wide kneel or the close kneel or the forward bow stance. It only has one foot to brace you laterally, and it's your front foot. If it's let's say we have a left front twist stance, and it's going to be your left foot or your front foot that gives you that sideways stability. But of course it's turned completely opposite from what you would have had it turned in a neutral bow or a forward bow, right? That's why it's called a twist stance, because your leg is completely twisted around the other way, right? But it's twisted far enough the opposite direction so you once more have that lateral stability, right? If you start in a neutral bow stance and now you're unwinding and you're going all the way to a twist stance, well, when you were in a neutral bow stance, your foot had lateral stability. It prevented you from being pushed over left or right so easily. And then when you finish your rotation and you're completely in a twist stance and your foot is turned completely the opposite direction, it once more has that bracing ability. But it didn't have it in between while it was getting there, right? So for a moment in the twist stance, you had no lateral stability when you were moving from the neutral to the twist. That's why you want to do it really quick, because you want to be able to get your foot to turn around and be basically the exact opposite of what you just had a moment ago, right? Before your opponent can push you off balance while you're trying to do this, right? So, in other words, while you're assuming a twist stance, unless you do it from a crossover, if you're pivoting in place, that is your other challenge, that you have to do this so fast that you're never caught without having any kind of a lateral bracing ability, because your back foot isn't going to give you any in a twist stance. You follow? Does this make sense? Now, what's the other aspect of why? So that's one reason why the twist stance doesn't have as much bracing ability, right? But it's still quite similar and equal to forward bow or wide kneel or close kneel, with just this limitation. But there's two other limitations that the twist stance has in terms of bracing ability, and the other two are basically for the depth now. In other words, how we're talking about how far the feet are apart, right? Well, already, just look at how close your feet are in a twist stance. Your feet are closer together in a twist stance by about a ratio of 1 to 2. They're twice as far in a neutral bow stance, more or less, right? Well, so that's already a shorter brace. That means that your weight distribution is distributed over only half the area that it was a moment ago, right? So that reduces your forward-back balance or bracing ability. But that's only the least of your trouble in a twist stance when it comes to bracing ability, because the real issue that most people are simply not aware of is that your bracing angles have dropped. Hey, let me explain it. In a neutral pose stance, your bracing angles are your thighs. Essentially, are your calves participating? Yes, of course they are. They're furthering the bracing angles. But what really prevents somebody from being able to just push or pull you off balance is the fact that your thighs are pointing away from your body. Just like a brace would do, right? You have a stand of something, the feet point away from the center. That's why they're called bracing angles, right? Well, now look, in a twist stance, your bracing angles are not up in your thighs anymore. All other stances have their bracing angles in their thighs, predominantly. A twist stance doesn't. You don't push your knees apart in a twist stance. Your knees are touching. This is the only stance where one knee is touching the other, the back of the other knee, right? So here, your bracing angles are in your calves. That means, of course, they're lower. So you can kind of say that in a twist stance, your bracing angles are from the knees, from your knees down. They're from your knees downward. While in all the other stances, your bracing angles are from the knees up, between your knees and your hips. It's your thighs, right? So naturally, we have a stance here that is shorter, has less distribution ability, only has one foot to give you lateral stability, and at the same time we drop the bracing angles way down, which means our upper body in a way is much taller now. What we have to balance now above is much higher now. That is hard, right? That's why it takes so much time to really develop a good twist stance. But yet on the other hand, the twist stance is extremely important. It gives you opportunities that you otherwise would not have, and it's certainly a huge part of Ed Parker's Kenpo. And the better you are with the stance and the better you understand it, the better your Kenpo is going to be. All right, now before we go on, we should talk about why do we use the twist stance in the first place. There is a lot of reasons for using a twist stance. Now the first and most obvious thing is, well, a twist stance allows you to rotate in place. Essentially, if you have